So I had really good experiences in Stafford. Early on, I do remember that I was at a public hearing when I was an assistant. And for those of you that are not familiar with Stafford, Stafford in the 80s was like the Wild Wild West. And it was so bad that they used to have the sheriff's department sit in on their meetings because people would get into fist fights. Sometimes the board members would get into fist fights. So this was a contentious matter. I was presenting something to the board. I'm at a mic. My back is to the audience like this because I'm talking to the board that's sitting up on the dais. And somebody yells out, and I don't want you to be offended, but you have to get the fact. That nigga doesn't know what she's talking about. You could have heard a pin drop. To the credit of the chairman of the board of supervisors at that time was a guy by the name of Choppy Wandrick. He took his gavel and hit it really hard and says, "We will have order in here." Because it was loud enough for everybody to hear. When that happened, I can't tell you how stunned I was. This is 1982. 1982. Nobody felt any compunction about saying that in a public meeting. I don't know who said it. Thank goodness that Choppy Wandrick lowered his gavel because it gave me enough to gather myself. I finished doing what I had to do because I remember when my father said, "You are not what people call you." So I finished my work. And as soon as I finished and they took their vote, I bolted out of the building. People running behind me because they know this is not a good situation. I get to the door and somebody says, "Where are you going?" I said, "I don't know. I have no idea, but I got to clear my head." Because this is 1982, y'all. I get in my car, and in 82 there's nothing in Stafford that was open at that time of night but the giant Grafton Shopping Center on 610 when it was a two-lane road. So I jump in my car and I go to Giant, and I'm just walking up and down the aisles like a lost soul trying to figure out what I'm going to do. Because now I've really reached a crisis point. I'm tired. I'm not 30 years old, and I mean I've been fighting this stuff for a long, long time. Is this a place I want to stay? I get in my car, I go back to work. Because I decided I wasn't going to let anybody run me away from something that I was enjoying. That's not the first time that happened to me. It happened later. It happened in the 90s. When I was on the phone with a lady who had called all around everywhere in the county because she wanted to put a barbed wire fence up, and she'd been told no everywhere. She didn't want to accept that. So me, thinking I'm Superwoman, I think I can solve this problem. So I'm saying, okay, I can solve your problem. Let's talk about why you can't have a barbed wire fence. You know, they only reserve those for like prisons. And I said, what is the problem? And she says, I got people trespassing across my yard, cutting over, going to the 7-Eleven, and I'm just sick of it, and I don't want them walking across my yard, blah, 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 blah. And so looking for a solution, I said to her, I said, well, ma'am, why don't we just notify the sheriff's office and see if they can put extra patrols on at certain times to see whether or not, you know, they can catch somebody. And you know, are you willing to prosecute? How am I going to do that? All niggas look alike. Again, I'm holding the phone. I have to make a decision. I do. The decision I make is that I'm not going to respond to her. I quickly say, ma'am, I've told you everything I can to help you, and I'm sorry. And I hung up the phone. I tell my secretaries, don't let that woman come back through to talk to me under any circumstances. Well, being Stafford, she wasn't satisfied with her answer from me, so she goes over my head. So she calls the elected officials, tells them that nobody in the county will help her out. And so they promptly call a meeting that involves the county administrator, the zoning administrator, me, the sheriff, and 2 elected officials. So I'm invited to the meeting, so I decide I'm gonna be late for the meeting. I'm not late. That's not one of my traits. Because you know the stereotype is black people are always late. So my parents told me, whatever you do, don't ever be late. Okay? That's how it shaped my life. So I decide I'm going to be late for the meeting. So they have to call down to my office to ask me to come. Well, as luck would have it, as I walk into the county administrator's office, there's a conference room, it's open, long table, table's full, there's one empty seat, and guess where it is? Right next to this lady. And apparently she'd been in there raising sand. And I walked in and I said, hello, Mrs. So-and-so, extended my hand and said, I'm Alda White, I'm the county attorney, and sat down. She started getting all her stuff, put it in her bag, and she goes, I'm finished, I'm gone. And she jumps up and leaves the room, leaving everybody there in shock but me. And Ralph Williams was the sheriff then, and Ralph looked at me. He said, Gail, what just happened here? He always called me Gail. He said, Gail, what just happened here? And I said, as Paul Harvey would say, would you like to know the rest of the story? And I told them the story. They were incensed that I hadn't told them. Well, I thought it would die because I didn't want to make a big deal of it. But that is what happens. Now, that's a story I often tell the young people to try to help them understand that sometimes silence is the best thing, because I got her. I got her in a way she never expected. She will never call a public office again and assume that she's talking to somebody that's like her. Needless to say, we never heard from her anymore. I get married. I have a child. We have to decide where to put him in school. Stafford still is not the most integrated place in the world. We lived in Stafford. And Scotty and I were being pursued by Fredericksburg Academy. They were just beginning, and everybody wanted us to have our child there. Of course, the last place I would put my child is in a private school, particularly something that's got academy associated with it. Same with my husband. But we did not want our child to have to repeat the same things we had been through. My goodness, Jeffrey was born in 1986, so this is 1990. You know, I'm thinking, do we do this again? So we decided to put him in school in the city, which was not uncommon for this area at the time. We paid tuition to go to a public school because the city had 3 schools at the time: an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school. So there wasn't going to be any question about diversity. There wasn't going to be any question about those things. So that is why we made the decision we made. And of course, it worked out really well for us. Then one day, Jeffrey, we pick him up from Hugh Mercer, and he says, Mommy, Daddy, did you know there was a time when black people and white people couldn't go to school together? And we said, yes, Jeffrey. That was us. Oh, no, it wasn't. That was a long, 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 long time ago. And we said, no, Jeffrey, maybe we should tell you a little bit about our stories, which we did. Now, it's not that we didn't make our child aware that he was black, but it was the time when we knew we had to start making him aware that people would judge him accordingly. And of course, I got the normal blowback that any parent would get, talking to their kid about how people will judge them, and it doesn't matter what color they are. And it's like, that is not right, that's not right. People should judge me by who I am, you know, that kind of talk. And we kept telling them, you have to do that, you have to do that. Well, an incident happened that helped to speed that along. Scotty was by that time a circuit court judge, and he was sitting in the courthouse right across the street. Those of you that are familiar with it, there's an alley behind that courthouse, and there's parking behind the courthouse. It was during the summer. My stepsons were driving. They came in, they parked in their father's parking space, and they were still in the car. Jeffrey jumped out of the car and was running down the alley, going around to knock on the window to have Maxine let him in, which is the normal routine they had. And as Jeffrey was walking through the alley, they were bringing prisoners out from the courtroom, believe it or not, outside. And the prison guard saw Jeffrey in shorts, 7 years old, and points a gun at him, yelling at him, stop. Jeffrey keeps on going because he didn't think he's talking to him. There's so much commotion. People are running out of the courtroom trying to figure out what's going on. The bailiffs, of course, and they're yelling at the top of their lungs, put that gun down. They're the judge's sons. They thought Jeffrey was going to try to break out the prisoners. That was a stark moment in our lives. Nothing happened seriously, but as my son, and I know he was 7 because I confirmed this with him on Friday, he said, Mom, I'll never forget having a gun pointed at me by an officer. Well, as he went on to be teenagers, because he was an athlete and he hung out with kids, some who may have been a questionable character, he had lots of experiences, not with that, but he would tell stories about how they would approach them, and then somebody would look up and say, that's Judge Scott's son, and then everything would go away. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not. Sometimes, you know, you were headed out, he was with athletes. Some of the kids were in parts of the city where There were issues that were legitimate, and if he was there, what happened may have happened. It may not all been driven by race, but it is certainly something that a black parent gets concerned about. So much so that Jeffrey, in that age and time, as a teenager, wanted to be like the other kids his age. You know, the baggy pants, the cornrows. And I told him, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And of course, this was a continuing battle in our house. And I said, no. And finally, one day he said, well, we got the baggy pants stuff down because Scotty took hold of that. But the braids were my thing. And I finally said to him, I said, you know, I always wanted a little girl. And so if you want to put braids in the head, go right ahead. I'll get bows to match every color shirt you have. And I'll put bows in your hair to match the shirt. And you can go out here every day with those braids in your hair. I remember at the time I was taking a parenting class at Trinity, and I told that story, and everybody said, oh, that's awful. Yeah, that's not a battle to fight with your child. I said, if you're a black mama, it is. Needless to say, he didn't get braids. He went to college and did it. Then he had a car accident, a one-car accident, where he skidded on the road in North Carolina, right across the Virginia line in North Carolina. He hit a sign, got stuck, called the police, because, you know, that's what you do. You call the police. Policeman came up, said you must have been doing something wrong. They tested him. He was dry. I mean, he didn't have any alcohol in him. And he says, you were driving recklessly, gave him a ticket. And he went back to Davidson. He went to Davidson College. That's my Presbyterian connection. He went back to Davidson and immediately took the braids out of his hair. And we never had any more discussion about braids because he understood what that meant. The other thing that happened to Jeffrey, and I'm going to stop with this because he goes on to school, so we can have some questions. Jeffrey had gone to school with the same group of kids from kindergarten all the way up. And so when you get to be juniors, you know, it's very competitive around colleges. Jeffrey had been an excellent student. Excellent student. He was a scholar athlete. There were schools that were looking at him. We heard from all kinds of schools. The one that my husband loved the most was Harvard. Jeffrey went there and said, I would never go there. Those people are stuck up. But in any event, that was his daddy's dream. But he heard from lots of schools, and he was applying. We took a big college tour and all of that, and he started applying to schools. And, you know, the braggadocious child that he was, because his head was this big, he was a star football player. He thought he was hot stuff. He would tell people that UVA was his safe school. Okay? That's how arrogant he was. So time comes for announcements of where they were admitted to school. And Jeffrey did get into UVA. He also got into Davidson. He got into Brown. He got into a few other places. The place he really wanted to get into was Stanford, and he didn't. But all of a sudden, things shifted during that period of time. Kids that he had been to school with that had known him forever. All of a sudden, people were saying things like, well, he only got into UVA because he was an athlete. He was crushed. These are kids that had known him, been in classes with him, whom he competed against. But when it came down to competing, somehow or another the belief was that he got there for some other reason other than his natural talents, meaning his brain, not his brawn. That's how insidious racism is. We have been told these things over and over and over, and even when you know people, sometimes you can't get it out of your mind. And when you don't get what you think you should get, and that's what Alan was talking about when he was talking about privilege, then somebody that is a minority that got it and you didn't had to get it for some other reason. Because they couldn't get it because they were bright. That was devastating. Devastating.